December 12, 1944. The sun had not yet risen over the pine forests of Louisiana when the rumble of a military truck broke the stillness of the dawn. Inside, 30 German women huddled together, their breath visible in the cold air, uniforms faded and threadbare. The vehicle came to a slow stop before a gate marked, Camp Ruston U.S. Army Internment Area. For many of them, this was the first time they had seen America with their own eyes, and it did not look as they imagined. The air was clean, the sky painfully wide, and the guards, young, polite men in pressed khaki, looked nothing like the monsters they had been told to expect. Yet fear clung to them. They were the defeated, the captured, the foreign. They did not know what kind of mercy or punishment awaited them here. Sergeant Michael O'Connor stood waiting near the gate, a clipboard in hand, his breath misting in the chill. He had seen prisoners before, mostly men, but this was different. These were women from a collapsed Reich, their faces pale from years of rationing, their eyes hollow but proud. He gave a short nod to the interpreter beside him, who began calling out names as the women filed out. Some limped, some carried small bundles of personal belongings wrapped in cloth. A few held each other's arms as if afraid that if they let go, the ground beneath them might open up and swallow them whole. Among them was Ingrid Müller, a former nurse from Hamburg. Her fingers, reddened from cold and overuse, clutched a small tin cross that had belonged to her brother, killed on the Eastern Front. She had tended to soldiers who came back from the front without limbs, without hope, and she had believed the stories about the Americans, that they starved prisoners, that they shot those who refused to work. When she stepped through the gate, she braced herself for cruelty. What greeted her instead was silence, order, and the faint, warm scent of something she could not yet name. Inside the camp, the women were shown to long wooden barracks, clean but Spartan. Straw mattresses lined the bunks, and small potbelly stoves burned weakly in the corners. They were told breakfast would be served shortly. Ingrid sat on the edge of her bunk beside Maria Fischer, a telegraph operator from Dresden who still wore the remains of her Luftwaffe jacket. Maria whispered, "They'll make us clean latrines. Then they'll feed us scraps." Her voice trembled, though she tried to make it sound certain. Ingrid said nothing. She was still thinking about that strange smell in the air, a mix of warmth, sweetness, and something baked. It stirred a hunger she had long learned to suppress. When the guards finally led them to the mess hall, the women moved cautiously, half expecting to be shouted at or shoved. Instead, the soldiers stood aside, letting them enter first. The hall was bright, with steam fogging the windows and sunlight starting to spill in through the frosted glass. The women stopped in their tracks. On the long wooden tables were trays, real metal trays, filled with scrambled eggs, orange slices, small cups of coffee, and something so pale and soft it almost glowed. White bread. A murmur rippled through the line. One woman covered her mouth in disbelief. Another crossed herself. Maria stared as if she were looking at a dream that would vanish if she blinked. "Das ist kein Brot," she whispered. "Das ist Kuchen. That's not bread. That's cake." The guards exchanged glances. Some smiled. O'Connor, watching from the doorway, found himself fighting a grin. He had heard rumors that the Germans didn't recognize American bread, that to them it was too soft, too sweet, too rich to be real. But seeing their faces, a mixture of awe and suspicion, made the rumor come alive. The interpreter stepped forward, speaking carefully in German. "You may eat. It is for you." Still no one moved. They waited for a trick, a shout, a command. Finally, Ingrid stepped up. Her hands shook as she reached for a slice. It felt unreal between her fingers, so light like it might crumble to dust. She took a cautious bite. The sweetness spread through her mouth. It was not the coarse, dark rye she had eaten all her life. It was soft, almost like pastry. She looked around, unsure whether to spit it out or keep chewing. Then Maria took a piece, then another woman, and within moments the hall filled with quiet sounds, chewing, sighs, muffled laughter that sounded more like disbelief than joy. O'Connor moved between tables, pretending to inspect but really just watching. He saw how they savored each bite, how their eyes softened, how their posture changed as warmth returned to their bodies. These women had been enemies only days ago, yet here they were, just hungry, tired human beings tasting comfort for the first time in years. The sergeant's thoughts drifted to his own sister back in Oklahoma, who sent him letters about war rations and victory gardens. He wondered if she too would have been kind to prisoners. One woman, her accent sharp from Bavaria, held up her bread and said something that made the others laugh quietly. The interpreter smiled and translated for O'Connor. She says, "If this is prison, then I surrender again tomorrow." Even O'Connor chuckled. The tension that had gripped the hall began to fade, replaced by something fragile but real, a shared understanding that perhaps this camp was not what they feared. After breakfast, the women were led outside for orientation. The Louisiana sun had risen now, spreading gold light over the red earth. Pine needles glistened from the morning frost. They were told the camp followed the Geneva Convention strictly. They would be given fair treatment, medical care, and proper meals. They could write letters, even request books. To women who had survived air raids, famine, and propaganda, it all sounded absurd. Yet the evidence was there: the bread, the eggs, the kindness. Later, as Ingrid sat beneath the bare branches near her barracks, she held a small piece of bread she had saved from breakfast, wrapped in a napkin. She broke it carefully in half and whispered almost to herself, "If only my mother could taste this." The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Across the yard, O'Connor spoke with another guard about logistics, unaware that the simple breakfast he had supervised that morning would live in the memory of those women for decades. When the bell rang for lunch, the same women who had entered the hall with suspicion now lined up with a different look, curiosity, even faint anticipation. Ingrid glanced at Maria and said in a tone halfway between laughter and sorrow, "If their bread tastes like this, what will their soup be like?" Maria smiled for the first time since the war began. "Maybe it will taste like peace." That afternoon, as the shadows lengthened over the camp fence, O'Connor stood smoking near the gate, watching the women walk back from the mess hall. For the first time they looked less like prisoners and more like visitors in a strange land, foreign but alive. He thought of how small acts, even as small as a loaf of bread, could undo years of hatred. The war was still raging oceans away, but here, inside this quiet camp in Louisiana, something unexpected had happened. And though none of them could yet name it, the first bite of American bread had begun to change everything. By the second week at Camp Ruston, the strangeness had become routine. The German women still woke early, still lined up for roll call, still moved through the day under watchful eyes, but something inside the camp had shifted. The fear that once clung to every gesture was loosening, replaced by a quiet, bewildered curiosity. The meals had become the unspoken center of their days. The bread that once shocked them was now something they waited for, the smell of it rising from the kitchen like a promise that the world, for a few hours, could feel safe again. Ingrid Müller had taken to helping in the mess hall. She claimed it was out of boredom, but the truth was more complicated. She wanted to understand how the Americans made everything taste so alive. The flour, the sugar, the coffee, each seemed drawn from an abundance she couldn't comprehend. She'd spent years rationing salt, boiling turnips until they turned gray, and now here she stood beside American cooks who tossed ingredients as though they'd never known scarcity. One morning, as she kneaded dough under the supervision of a corporal named Harris, she asked in hesitant English, "You have no shortages?" The man laughed, shaking his head. "Shortages? Lady, this is Louisiana. We got farms for miles." He didn't see the flicker of disbelief that crossed her face. Maria Fischer spent her mornings in the laundry. It was hot, humid work, and yet even there, kindness found her in small ways. A young guard named Billy from Kansas City often carried the heavy water pails for her, saying it was no job for a lady. The first time he said it, Maria thought he was mocking her, but his shy grin told another story. He'd never met a German before. She'd never met an American who treated her like an equal. Their exchanges were brief, awkward, him trying to teach her English words, her laughing at his accent, but those moments filled the long, monotonous hours with something dangerous: humanity. The camp commander, Captain Dawson, had been in charge of German POWs before, but even he was surprised by the change in the women's demeanor. Reports described them as cooperative, industrious, even cheerful. They sang sometimes while working. The guards, who had expected resentment or defiance, were unsettled by how easily warmth replaced suspicion. Dawson wrote in his logbook, "There is something profoundly disarming about feeding those we were trained to fight." He understood that these women were not soldiers. They were the aftermath of war, torn from homes, carrying grief in silence. But he also knew the power of perception. Treating them well wasn't just moral, it was political. The U.S. needed to show the world that democracy could be merciful. Still, not everyone approved. Some soldiers grumbled that the prisoners were eating better than American civilians. Others mocked the women for their astonishment over simple things, like soap or sugar. When Ingrid once asked why their bread was so white, a guard joked, "Because we wash it." The remark drew laughter from his peers, but Ingrid only nodded thoughtfully, unsure whether it was humor or truth. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They laugh often even when there is nothing to laugh about. Perhaps that is why they are winning this war." The central conflict, though invisible at first, was growing inside them all. For the prisoners, it was the slow erosion of everything they had believed. For the Americans, it was the uncomfortable realization that their enemies were not monsters, but mirror images, tired, frightened, and painfully human. Every meal served, every small kindness extended, chipped away at propaganda on both sides. One afternoon, during kitchen duty, Ingrid witnessed something that stayed with her. A shipment of food arrived: crates of flour, canned fruit, even powdered milk. One of the German women, Anna, gasped when she saw the supplies and whispered, "Enough to feed a village." The cook, an older man named Jenkins, overheard her and smiled gently. "In America," he said, "we like to make sure nobody goes hungry." It wasn't arrogance. It was simple fact. But to the women who had scavenged through rubble and watched their families starve, those words struck deep. That night Anna couldn't eat. She sat on her bunk staring at her untouched bread as if ashamed of wanting it. Meanwhile, Maria's quiet friendship with Billy drew the attention of others. Some whispered disapproval, she, a German, sharing smiles with a guard, but the camp's walls did little to stop hearts from softening. Once, during lunch, he offered her a small packet of something wrapped in paper. "Try it," he said. Inside was a piece of peanut butter candy. She looked at it suspiciously. "It smelled like glue." Billy laughed. "Just taste it." She did, and immediately coughed. "It's stick," she exclaimed, trying to swallow. Billy grinned. "Yeah, that's the point." For the first time in months, Maria laughed so hard she cried. Stories like hers spread quietly through the camp. Women began comparing foods, learning English words, even teaching the guards German in return. "Kartoffel," one said, pointing to the potatoes. "Potato," the guard replied. "Nein, Kartoffel." The exchange would repeat until both sides were laughing, not realizing that this absurd little lesson was doing something history books rarely capture. It was healing. Yet beneath the surface, guilt lingered. Ingrid couldn't shake the image of her patients back home. The frozen streets of Hamburg, the emaciated faces she had tried and failed to save. Every bite she took here felt like betrayal. One night she confided this to Maria. "Do you ever feel wrong for being fed so well?" Maria nodded slowly. "Every day. But maybe it's not wrong to learn what life could be if people were kind." Ingrid turned that sentence over in her mind for hours afterward. Captain Dawson too wrestled with doubts. He had lost men in Europe. His brother's unit never returned from Normandy. Yet when he watched the women working in the fields, he saw not the enemy, but civilians trapped in the machinery of war. He once told O'Connor, Maybe victory isn't just who has more guns. Maybe it's who remembers to stay human. As winter turned to early spring, the women grew healthier. Their cheeks regained color, their laughter came more easily. Some began to send letters home, writing carefully, "We are treated well. You would not believe the food." These letters, screened by censors, still carried truth between the lines. Truth that would later ripple across post-war Germany, challenging the myth of American cruelty. One morning, during breakfast, Jenkins the cook announced that today they'd be serving something new. The women looked at each other nervously. From the kitchen came the rich aroma of something frying. When the plates were served, Ingrid stared down in confusion. Small round cakes, golden and warm, sat beside a jug of syrup. "Pancakes," Jenkins said proudly. "American tradition." The women tasted them and exchanged wide-eyed glances. Sweetness, warmth, softness. It was overwhelming. "You eat this often?" Maria asked. Jenkins chuckled. "Every Sunday, ma'am." Ingrid put down her fork. In Germany, Sundays were for air raids. The room fell quiet. Then Jenkins, with a heavy sigh, said, "Maybe that's why we make them sweet." It was a small moment, yet it lingered like a lesson neither side would forget. For the prisoners, food was no longer just sustenance, it was revelation. For the guards, serving it became a quiet act of penance for a war they hadn't chosen. The strange warmth that filled that mess hall wasn't comfort alone. It was reconciliation, still fragile, still incomplete. And as the women returned to their barracks that day, Ingrid looked back at the American flag waving over the gate and murmured, half to herself, "They win battles with bread." The thought startled her, for she had meant it not as accusation, but as admiration. She didn't yet know it, but that realization marked the beginning of her transformation, and the real conflict was no longer between nations, but within her own heart. By April of 1945, Camp Ruston had transformed into something unrecognizable from the grim detention center the German women first imagined. The fences still stood, the guards still carried rifles, yet the mood inside felt more like a strange, suspended peace than imprisonment. Spring sunlight warmed the pine needles, and laughter sometimes drifted from the mess hall windows. What had begun as fear had turned into a hesitant kind of trust. Yet beneath that calm surface, something deeper stirred, an awakening none of them had expected. Ingrid Müller had become a fixture in the camp kitchen, no longer out of curiosity but out of quiet purpose. She had learned the rhythm of the place, the morning deliveries, the recipes, the patience of measuring and stirring. The American cooks respected her skill, she respected their generosity. But lately Ingrid felt a restlessness she couldn't name. Each time she handled sugar or butter, she thought of the hunger still raging across Europe, of mothers feeding their children scraps of bark and broth. Every act of abundance here seemed to mock the memory of scarcity. She didn't know whether to be grateful or ashamed. One afternoon, while kneading dough, she found herself speaking aloud without meaning to. "How can we eat like this when our people starve?" Jenkins, the cook beside her, paused his stirring and wiped his hands on a towel. "You're prisoners," he said softly, "but you're still people. We can't fix the whole world, but we can start with a meal." His words lingered. Ingrid wanted to argue, but she couldn't. The bread beneath her hands was proof enough that decency could exist even in war. Maria Fischer, meanwhile, had grown bolder. Her English was improving, her laughter more frequent. She no longer flinched when guards approached. Billy, the young soldier who once brought her water, now brought her books, thin paperbacks from the camp library. They'd sit across from each other during lunch, pretending to study vocabulary lists while exchanging stories about home. He told her about Kansas wheat fields, wide skies, and baseball. She told him about Dresden, about music halls and the scent of rain before the firebombing. Neither spoke of the war directly, but both understood it lived in the silence between their sentences. One day, as they walked near the fence line, Maria noticed a small bird's nest wedged in the barbed wire. Two chicks chirped blindly, untouched by the sharp metal. They live even here, she murmured. Billy nodded. Guess life doesn't care about fences. The remark seemed simple, but it stayed with her. That night she wrote in her small notebook, perhaps kindness is not weakness. Perhaps it is the last rebellion left to us. But not everyone shared their ease. Anna, the woman who once refused to eat out of guilt, had grown withdrawn. She could not reconcile the comfort of the camp with the suffering she knew existed back home. When the women received Red Cross letters confirming that many German cities had fallen into ruin, Anna broke down. We sit here eating white bread, she cried, while our brothers die. Her outburst sent a chill through the barracks. Ingrid sat beside her, unsure how to console her. Would you rather we starved too? She asked gently. Anna shook her head. No. I would rather I didn't feel grateful. It was the truest sentence any of them had spoken. Gratitude felt dangerous. It threatened loyalty to the pain they carried. The women found themselves caught between two identities, prisoners of war and guests of mercy. To accept kindness from their enemy felt like betrayal, yet to reject it meant denying the humanity that was keeping them alive. That conflict, quiet but unrelenting, defined their days. In early May, rumors began to circulate through the camp. Germany was collapsing. Some guards whispered that the war in Europe was nearly over. The women, torn between dread and relief, listened through the walls for any mention of surrender. One evening, Captain Dawson confirmed what they all suspected. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the war was ending. There was no cheering, only stunned silence. A few women cried. Others simply stared at the ground, unsure whether to mourn or rejoice. Afterward, the camp felt different. The guards seemed less strict, their footsteps lighter. The women walked freely between work sites. Yet a strange melancholy settled over everyone, as if they had lost not only a war but a purpose. Ingrid found herself unable to sleep. The word peace sounded hollow, like a promise whispered through smoke. What would become of them now? The next morning, O'Connor approached her while she was baking. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. You heard the news? She nodded. It's over. He studied her face. You don't look happy. She replied quietly, peace is harder to believe than war. He smiled sadly. Ain't that the truth? Then after a pause he added, you know, some of you might go home soon. Ingrid didn't answer. Home. The word no longer had shape. Hamburg was rubble. Her family, gone. What was there to return to? A week later, Maria found Billy sitting near the fence, staring at the sky. You will go home, he said when she approached. You'll be free again. She tried to smile. And you? He shrugged. Back to Kansas, I guess. I'll miss the jokes. Maria looked down at her hands, then whispered, I will miss the fences. He frowned. The fences? She nodded. Because at least they made sense. The day of Germany's official surrender arrived quietly at Camp Ruston. The flag was lowered to half-mast. The women gathered outside, uncertain how to feel. Ingrid stood among them, watching the American soldiers salute their fallen allies and enemies alike. In that solemn gesture, something inside her shifted. She realized that the kindness she'd witnessed here was not weakness. It was strength, the kind her own nation had forgotten. She thought of Jenkins's words, we can't fix the world, but we can start with a meal. Perhaps peace began that way too, not with treaties but with bread. That evening, the mess hall served a special dinner, stew, cornbread, and slices of apple pie. The women ate slowly, aware it might be their last meal as prisoners. The air felt thick with emotion, laughter mixing with quiet sobs. Maria raised her cup of coffee toward Billy, who nodded from across the room. Ingrid looked around at the faces she had come to know so intimately, each carrying stories that no history book would ever record. When the lights dimmed and the women returned to their bunks, Ingrid sat awake, listening to the crickets outside. She held a small piece of bread in her hand like a token. No longer felt like cake. It felt like memory, a symbol of everything they had learned in captivity about mercy, dignity, and the strange generosity of strangers. Before she blew out the candle, she whispered into the still air, "If this is what defeat tastes like, then perhaps it is not defeat at all." Outside, the camp was quiet except for the distant hum of a generator. Beyond the fences, America stretched vast and alive. The women didn't know when they would be sent home, or what home even meant anymore. But something had already changed within them, something irreversible. The bread had softened more than hunger. It had softened hearts. And somewhere in that quiet Louisiana night, as the guards exchanged tired jokes and the prisoners drifted into uneasy dreams, the last barrier between enemy and friend finally began to crumble. Summer arrived like a secret whispered through the pines, soft and warm, carrying with it a strange tension neither freedom nor captivity could quite resolve. The war was over. The flags had changed, the world had tilted, and yet the women of Camp Ruston remained behind the same wire fences, waiting for orders that never came fast enough. They were no longer prisoners of war, at least not officially, but the machinery of repatriation moved slowly. It was as if no one quite knew what to do with them now that the hatred had ended. For many of them, returning home meant returning to nothing. For others, it meant facing ghosts they were not ready to meet. Ingrid Müller found herself at a crossroads of gratitude and grief. The kitchen where she once sought distraction had become her sanctuary. Every morning she baked as if the act itself kept her alive. Jenkins had left the camp, reassigned, and his replacement, a quiet sergeant named Walker, gave her free rein over the ovens. She took it as a kind of farewell gift. Sometimes, as the bread rose and browned, she would watch the golden crust form and imagine it as the sunlight over a land still capable of forgiveness. Her hands had grown stronger, her English smoother, her face softer with color. Yet each loaf she pulled from the oven carried a question she couldn't silence. What happens when kindness ends? Maria Fischer felt that question too, though her answer came in the form of dread. Word had arrived that repatriation ships were being organized in New York. Soon they would be sent back, home to Germany, home to the ruins. Billy no longer came by as often. He still waved at her across the yard, but the conversations had grown shorter, the smiles forced. One evening she caught him sitting near the fence again, tossing pebbles into the dust. When she approached, he didn't look up. "They say you'll be leaving soon," he said flatly. She nodded. "Yes. Maybe next month." Silence stretched between them. Then he said, "Guess you'll get real bread again." She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "No," she said. "I will never taste bread like this again." The following days were filled with preparations, medical checks, paperwork, interviews. Some women were ecstatic, already dreaming of home. Others trembled at the thought. Ingrid fell somewhere in between. She helped pack supplies for those leaving, tying bundles with careful knots as if each string held her emotions together. At night, she dreamed of her mother's kitchen in Hamburg, now likely a pile of ash. She awoke each morning with a sense of loss that deepened, not eased, by kindness. Captain Dawson watched the women from his office window with a heaviness he couldn't shake. He'd been proud of how Camp Ruston operated, orderly, humane, honorable. Yet as the end drew near, he saw what war left behind. People changed beyond repair. One afternoon, as he walked the perimeter, he found Ingrid sitting alone outside the mess hall, her apron still dusted with flour. "You're quiet these days," he said. She looked up, smiling faintly. "Quiet is better than angry." He nodded. "You'll be leaving soon." "Yes," she replied. "But I don't know where I'll be going." There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. Dawson hesitated, then said, "You'll go home." She shook her head. "Home is not a place anymore, Captain. It is a memory." In the final week before departure, a storm swept through Louisiana. The rain came hard, drumming against roofs and flooding the dirt paths between the barracks. The electricity flickered, and the camp slipped into a rare, unguarded darkness. That night, Ingrid couldn't sleep. She rose quietly and went to the kitchen, lighting a single lantern. The room glowed amber, soft and unreal. She decided to bake one last batch of bread. Her hands moved with instinct, measuring, stirring, kneading. The dough was warm under her palms, alive in a way that comforted her. She worked until dawn. By morning the storm had passed. The camp smelled of wet earth and yeast. When the women gathered for breakfast, Ingrid brought out the loaves herself, still steaming, their crusts cracked with perfection. The Americans stared. She had made enough for everyone, guards included. Dawson, surprised, asked, "Is this some kind of farewell?" Ingrid smiled. "It's bread," she said simply. "It doesn't ask who deserves it." The room went quiet. Then, slowly, the guards began to eat. So did the women. No one spoke, but the air felt thick with something sacred, gratitude, maybe, or forgiveness disguised as appetite. Afterward, as the dishes were cleared, Maria approached Ingrid with red-rimmed eyes. "They say the trucks come tomorrow," she whispered. Ingrid nodded. "Then we'll go together." Maria looked down. "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of peace," she said. "War, I understand." Ingrid reached out and took her hand. "Then we'll learn peace the same way we learned bread, slowly." That night, a small gathering formed near the fence. The guards, unarmed for once, stood with the prisoners. Someone brought a harmonica. Someone else lit a lantern. They sang, softly at first, then stronger. Old German folk songs mixed with American hymns, their voices rising and falling like waves. Billy stood near Maria, eyes on the ground. When the song ended, he said quietly, "I'll miss this place." She smiled through tears. "You'll miss your prisoners?" He shook his head. "No. I'll miss remembering that enemies can be kind." At dawn the trucks arrived. The women climbed aboard, carrying the small bags they'd packed with care. Maria found a seat by the window. Ingrid sat beside her, holding a single loaf wrapped in cloth, the last one she had baked. As the engines rumbled to life, the Americans lined up outside to salute. Dawson stood at the front, hat in hand. O'Connor beside him looked down, swallowing hard. When the truck began to move, Ingrid leaned out the window and called, "Thank you, for the bread." Her voice trembled, but it carried across the yard. Billy raised his hand in reply, shouting, "Thank you, for not wasting it." The others laughed softly, waving until the fence disappeared behind the dust. Hours later, when the convoy reached the train station, Ingrid unwrapped the loaf. She tore it in half and gave a piece to Maria. They ate in silence as the whistle sounded. It was still warm inside, though they were far from the ovens that made it. Ingrid closed her eyes. The taste was sweet, familiar, filled with every contradiction she had lived: shame and gratitude, loss and grace. As the train began to move east, she pressed her forehead to the glass. Fields stretched endlessly, the sky widening with every mile. She thought of Jenkins, of Dawson, of the laughter that once filled the mess hall. She thought of how war had taught her cruelty, but captivity had taught her something harder: compassion. She turned to Maria and said softly, "When we tell them, they won't believe us." Maria nodded. "Then we'll bake them bread and they'll understand." The train rattled onward, the countryside blurring into color and motion. Behind them, the camp that once divided enemies now stood quiet beneath the Louisiana sun. For the women inside that train, freedom felt uncertain, but they carried something stronger than fear: the memory of humanity rediscovered through a single, simple act. Ingrid held the last piece of bread in her hand, broke it gently and whispered, "For mercy." Then she tossed it out the window. The crust caught the wind, scattering like dust, like blessing. And as the train carried them homeward through a land that had once been their enemy, the women of Camp Ruston left behind more than their captivity. They left proof that even in the ruins of war, kindness could still rise, warm and whole, like bread fresh from the oven.